Good morning.
Good morning.
9 years ago, next month, I stood right here and spoke about climate change. I was fed up, disgusted, and concerned. Why? Because during the entire 2012 presidential campaign, I had not heard or read one word about climate change from any source. Not either candidate, not the press, not radio, not TV. And I was determined that at least this fellowship should hear a few responsible comments on that subject. Forming the Climate Change Coalition never crossed my mind. Until, after my second talk, I was corralled by Mary and a few other folks and forcibly reminded that, Dick, what you did was good, but not good enough. You've got to do more. So I appear before you this morning somewhat conflicted. Conflicted because on the one hand, I feel it is dishonest to minimize or dismiss the very real dangers, very difficult times. All responsible climate scientists are confident await us if we and the rest of the world don't very soon start to insist on some major changes in the way we humans occupy this planet. I could very easily stand right here and shock you with a litany of possible horror stories. I choose not to do that. On the other hand, there is hope. Hope for a human population to occupy our Earth in a more sustainable manner. More and more people are becoming informed and engaged. But we are running out of time. Following the lead of Greta Thunberg, the teenage Swedish girl, I suggested that climate change crisis is at least in part a crisis of the imagination. We need to imagine the seemingly impossible. We need to imagine a brand new world. The Guardian stated, quote, "We need to create a space for apocalyptic thinking." And then they continued by saying, which may at least delay, if not avert, the catastrophes ahead. And yet every day, Mama Nature demonstrates how to do it, demonstrates the way forward. The lesson is very clear. First, the Earth is powered by renewable energy. Second, do no harm. Third, recycle, recycle, recycle. Every day, Mama Nature demonstrates the stream of energy which flows out of the soil, in the plants, then in the animals, then back into the soil. It's a never-ending circuit. Unfortunately for us, we seem to be immersed in a boosterous age with little space for rational thinking. Let me cite three very brief statements supporting that thesis. One, Anatov Gosch reminds us the reality that growth in many coastal cities, including some of ours, growth around the world now depends on ensuring that a blind eye is turned toward risk. Second, Gandhi commented 90 years ago, he said this, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization in the manner of the West. If our entire nation took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the earth bare like locusts." That was 90 years ago. And finally, here is a teenage Greta Thunberg, who's 18 years old now, still a teenager. We need a whole new way of thinking. The political system that you have created is all about competition. You cheat when you can because all that matters is to win, to get power. That must come to an end. You must stop competing with each other. We need to cooperate and work together to share the resources of the planet in a fair way. We need to start living within the planetary boundaries. In other words, we need to more closely mimic Mama Nature. Until now, I trust that most of us understand that we on this planet have experienced an extraordinarily long period of remarkable climate stability. Now, there have been some brief exceptions, to be sure, but for 12,000 years, our climate has been livable and reasonably stable. But we tend to forget that that hasn't always been the case. Our earthly home has, in fact, experienced numerous devastating impacts. And furthermore, unless you've been living in a cave on the moon, you are well aware of current tragic weather events: extensive wildfires, punishing drought, excessive rainfall, flooding, record-setting heat. And all of that comes with an increase in world temperature of 1 degree. 1 degree. Now, I suspect that most of us are probably aware that 65 million years ago, a huge ball of ice, roughly 6 miles in diameter, slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and created a crater about 100 miles across and 6 miles deep. The energy expended there was more than 1 billion times the power of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima. 1 billion would be. And that impact resulted in the loss of 70% of all land animals. And that included dinosaurs, except for a few dinosaur species that turned out to be the progenitors of our modern birds. And then about 252 million years ago, 90% of everything, land animals, plants, marine creatures, disappeared, was gone. Why? Because a huge volcano in Siberia had erupted, throwing tons of sulfur into the air and resulting in acid rain with the consistency of vinegar. And even more astonishingly, because of that event, global warming increased an unbelievable 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And it would literally take millions of years for this planet, our home, to recover from that impact. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, 35 million or 65 million years ago is ancient history. Yeah, it is a long time ago. And 252 million years is unfathomable. I agree. That stuff did happen a long time ago, long before we Homo sapiens appeared on the scene. But those events remind us of what can happen and what has happened in the past. And they also remind us of a very important fact that gets misstated over and over and over again. Such climate-changing events do not imperil the planet. They do imperil planetary life. Let me repeat that. Such events don't imperil planet Earth. They do imperil life on Earth. So, if 65 million years ago and 252 million years ago are too ancient to worry about, how about 200 years ago? 200 years ago. Are we aware? Do we give any thought to what happened then, specifically in 1815? Just like 9 years ago, when I said I haven't heard anything about climate change, I have never heard anything said, discussed, written about what happened just 200 years ago. Now, what happened was that Indonesia's Mount Tambora exploded, unleashing the most destructive wave of extreme weather the world has witnessed in thousands of years. The massive sulfate dust enveloped the Earth, cooling temperatures and disrupting major weather systems worldwide for more than 3 years. Devastating storms, droughts, and floods. Communities worldwide endured famine, disease, and civil unrest on a catastrophic scale. In other words, even though I have never heard a word about that event, I've never heard it discussed, never read anything about it. That does for us a cautionary warning about the potential tragic impacts of climate change that might occur. Now, the year following that eruption, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Weather anomalies in Europe and right here in New England ruined crops, displaced millions of people, and spawned chaos and disease. That eruption also, believe it or not, and this is hard to believe, initiated the worldwide cholera pandemic, expanded opium markets in China, set the stage for Ireland's Great Famine, and plunged our country into its first economic depression. Who could have guessed? Such happens to be triggered by a volcano eruption in Indonesia. And who knows what equally unanticipated events might be precipitated by our currently warming climate. Nobody can predict. Now, the worst effects of that eruption lasted 3 years, 1815 to 1818. Again, it was 1816, labeled as the year without a summer. Everywhere, Asia, Europe, United States, hunger, disease, loss of homes, loss of livelihood. The social changes wrought by this event can be traced decades into the future. And similar predictions are expected for us if climate change is not promptly curtailed. Now, here is one formerly completely unpredicted example resulting from Tambor's explosion. China's southwest province, Yunnan, enjoyed a long history of peace buoyed by an unusually beneficent climate. Yunnan seldom had winter temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or summer temperatures above 72. I expect for many Chinese that is close to heaven on earth. Would be for many of us. The 7,000-year history of domesticated rice production, according to some historians, started right there in Yunnan. Now, rice is a very hardy crop, and farmers in Yunnan were skilled farmers. They routinely planted 5 different varieties of rice, each cultivated for specific temperatures and elevation. But none was hardy enough to survive Tambora. Furthermore, Yunnan had the most stored food supply per capita of any province in China. That wasn't sufficient either. At some point in the late 1810s, after years of the worst famine in their experience, desperate peasant farmers in Yunnan came to the realization that growing poppies for opium was as good as money and more reliable than food. The poppy was worth twice as much per acre, and it could grow on reasonably inhospitable soil. So poppy farming exploded. Thus, Yunnan transformed their agricultural economy from staple grains to an opium cash crop. But also what happened was the formation, the first emergence of a modern illicit drug trade. Again, due to eruption of a volcano in Indonesia. 200 years later, we are still, and we all know it, reaping the effects of Yunnan's 3-year famine. And note, please, we are talking only about 3 years of cruddy weather, not a seemingly endless period of time. The effects of runaway global warming, should they occur, will be social disruption on global scales and centennial time frames. Now, the 2 very important points to keep in mind. First, the misery of the Tambora period, years of famine, disease, and homelessness, was borne overwhelmingly by the poor. Exactly the same consequences predicted for people in this century as a result of climate change. And maybe even more important, most of the temperature extremes and excessive rainfall precipitation by Tambor are, in fact, within the range of possible events for us if we don't very soon start dramatically reducing carbon dioxide emissions. It's difficult to think of any aspect of our lives, any aspect of our society that won't be transformed in the coming decades for the worse. Now we can wring our hands, bury our heads. We can ignore the problem because many of us will be dead, although living is still good in good old Door County. Or we can elect to do whatever we can to minimize future human suffering. Very simply, it's up to us. There is no one else. Despair or hope. Engagement or business as usual. I really hate having to say this, but I can't help it. Prior massively destructive events, including the Tambor eruption, were all caused by natural causes. Natural causes, completely independent of Homo sapiens. And it is almost unbelievable for any thinking person, it seems to me, that we are now facing the prospect of a technologically advanced society, in other words, us, seemingly intent on destroying ourselves. How can it be more ironic that a species named Wise, sapiens, Wise, a species named Wise is responsible for such completely irresponsible behavior? So where does all this leave us? Is there no hope? Yes, there is indeed hope. Yes, there is. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. But only if we act in promptly decisive ways. And we have to admit, if we're honest, that projected trends, assuming business as usual, are frightful. So with that in mind, we must understand that the fight to minimize climate change is truly a fight for nothing less than the vindication of life, all life, not just human life. It is a fight to create a more beautiful world for us and all life. Now, I fully recognize that the magnitude of the action necessary can leave us stranded in impotence. I understand that. And I also understand there's not much individuals working alone can do. But our individual actions, our individual footprints are not inconsequential, if for no other reason than they set a hopeful example for others. On the other hand, the focus just on individual actions can blind us to the structural causes of problems and to the factors that restrict personal behavior. Let me share a couple quotes, or in fact, 4 quotes, 3 by the climate activist Bill McKibben. 1, if you're feeling hopeless, you're not working hard enough. 2, in response to the frequently asked question, what can one individual do? McKibben says this: what can one individual do is not the right question. One individual alone can do very little. But what one individual can do is join forces with others and support a group devoted to minimizing the adverse effects of climate change. And if enough of us join or support such a group, we will survive. Alone, we won't. Our earthly environment displays no boundaries and thereby forces us into solidarity with all other peoples. Climate violence urges us to converge at all levels, local, national, and international. We cannot afford personal loyalties that blind us to the need for collective action. Now, transformation can come about in many ways, but it is absolutely crucial to recognize the obstacles we face. Huge profits have been made and are continuing to be made from the establishment and endurance of the status quo. Many people, quite frankly, have a lot to lose from the solution to climate change. Not the least of these are some vested interests, especially the countries and businesses drawing significant wealth and power from controlling energy. We must be tactically innovative. We must popularize new visions. We must build widespread support for economic transformation. Now, I can imagine some of us rolling our eyes and saying, come on, Dick, come on, get real. Get serious. You seem to think we can do the impossible. Now, yes, it is an enormous task we face, but it is not. It is not impossible. And we need to always remember, and I suspect this is not widely appreciated, successful social transformation relies on the sustained participation of a very small minority. How big a minority? Evidence clearly shows that 3.5% of a population continuously engaged can obtain success. Are you willing to be in that number? If not, will you support those who are? Will you support organizations working to minimize the adverse effects of climate change? Let me just tick off a few worthy of your support. World Wildlife Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, 350.org, Earth Justice, all would be appropriate. And so would your local chapter working on climate change. And you might also ask yourself a few questions. Let me suggest a few that I would hope you have thought about or will think about. One, how much of my quote spare time and how much of my charitable contributions are contributing to combating climate change? Two, have you designed your investment portfolio to support only green industries? Three, have you made any lifestyle changes in your diet, in your travel plans, or in your purchasing habits? And four, where do you set your thermostat in the summer? And where do you set it in the winter? Remember, doing something is always better than doing nothing. Now there is a lot of good news. The seeds of possibility are everywhere. Solar and wind are becoming cheaper and more commonly used. Storage batteries are improving. Climate change has become a common topic in the press and on radio and TV. And around the world, social movements have overcome staggering odds. If you just think about this for a minute, from controlling homophobia to denouncing the entrenched culture of sexual violence, proposed issues have been transformed into dominant conversations within a period of just a few years. Thousands of proposed extractor projects have been defeated by communities. Dozens of communities have outlawed fossil fuel extraction and declared themselves off limits for mining. Thousands of cities and municipalities are pushing bold commitments on emission reductions. Over 1,000 laws on climate change are now in place around the world. More than 1,000. We are not helpless. But we need to get busy. What human beings decide to do now in the next few years will shape human destiny. Christiana Figueres, whom Mary and I had the pleasure of meeting some time ago, is the former head of the UN Climate Change Convention held in Paris in 1815. She's also the daughter of a former Costa Rican president. She's now 65 years old. And she has stated as follows: this generation, our generation, is the most consequential generation in human history. We have the capital, the technology, the policies, and we have the scientific knowledge, unquote. In other words, we know what we have to do, and we have the capability to do it. And then she continues like this: we are facing the most consequential fork in the road, but we can only choose it this decade. Our parents did not have this choice because they didn't have the capital, the technologies, and the understanding. And for our children, it will be too late. So this is a decade, and we are the generation. So finally, I would say this. Bill and Kevin reminds us that we really do live in an unbearably beautiful planet. Furthermore, we are the only creatures on that planet who can decide not to do something we are fully capable of doing. We're the only ones. Climate change represents the possibility we could become. Now, I said earlier that climate crisis is a crisis of the imagination. Yes. And this is vitally important because who we are now has never been more incompatible with whom we need to be. Let me repeat that. Who we are now has never been more incompatible with whom we need to be. Business as usual, or life as usual, should be unacceptable for every one of us. The transformative changes we need to bring about, along with social and economic justice for all, represent nothing short of a new vision of humanity, no longer obstructed by the worldview of human supremacy. Learning to inhabit Earth with care, with grace, with proper measure, promises material and spiritual abundance for every one of us. But remember, this is the decade. We are the generation. Let's get busy.